At 6:30 a.m., the 27th of August, at the African Development Summit in Addis Ababa, before hundreds of international journalists and dozens of world leaders, Ibrahim Traoré took a step almost unheard of in modern politics. He issued a bold, public ultimatum to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. No hedging, no diplomatic sugarcoating, only unshakable resolve. Staring directly into the camera, Traoré declared, "Mr. Netanyahu, you have 48 hours to apologize to Africa, or you will no longer be welcome here." It was not a threat of war. It was a strike of dignity, a statement so direct that the conference hall fell silent. Within minutes, clips of the moment began circulating across the world, igniting debates from Johannesburg to Washington. This was not just about one dispute between two leaders. It was about the respect Africa demands and the sovereignty it refuses to bargain away. This diplomatic earthquake did not begin with a speech. It began with a leak. According to multiple diplomatic sources, during a closed-door G7 meeting, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu allegedly made remarks that African leaders considered deeply offensive, particularly targeting Burkina Faso's president, Ibrahim Traoré. He was reported to have dismissed them as political opportunists and naive in their criticism of Israel's Gaza campaign. Journalists and diplomats later confirmed that the language used behind closed doors was even harsher, including terms such as crude and militantly theatrical to describe Africa's response. Sources further indicated that Netanyahu even hinted at supporting IMF efforts to tighten debt recovery across African nations, a stance that further heightened diplomatic tensions. Beyond that, he was also said to have floated the idea of creating a new alliance under Western sponsorship tied to the so-called Great Reconstruction 2030 Pact, a suggestion that immediately raised fears of a geopolitical restructuring that could sideline Africa's interests. When the leak broke, outrage swept across African media and social networks. On Africa News, the story dominated the headlines. Within hours, the hashtag number "Africa is not your pawn" was trending, generating millions of shares. Yet while public anger reached a boiling point, Traoré chose silence, a silence that, in hindsight, was deliberate. At the Addis Ababa summit, Traoré stepped to the podium with unwavering resolve and proclaimed Africa's dignity. "Mr. Netanyahu, Africa will not be your pawn, nor the subject of debt chains or Western-sponsored experiments. This is not a game of alliances, it is a question of dignity. You have 48 hours to apologize, or you will no longer be welcome on this continent. Not in trade, not in diplomacy, not in the future of history." The room froze. Journalists stopped, mid-keystroke. Delegates glanced at one another in disbelief. It was not a threat of violence. It was a challenge of dignity, a direct strike against the imbalance of power that had defined Africa's relationship with the West for decades. In that instant, Burkina Faso was no longer just a nation in West Africa. It became the epicenter of a global conversation about respect, sovereignty, and the future of African diplomacy. The 72-hour countdown began the moment Ibrahim Traoré stepped off the podium, and almost instantly, the world reacted. Social media lit up across the continent and beyond. On Africa News, the story dominated the front page. The hashtag number "Africa is not your pawn" trended globally on X, TikTok, and Facebook, amassing millions of views within the first day. But the reactions weren't just online. From government offices to university campuses, the words of the president of Burkina Faso were repeated, dissected, and celebrated. For many Africans, this was not simply a diplomatic dispute, it was a rare, unfiltered moment of defiance against years of being sidelined in international decision-making. Support quickly poured in. South Africa's foreign minister reposted the viral clip, writing, "Finally, someone said it." The former Kenyan ambassador to the UN added on Twitter, "This is the future of African diplomacy, fearless and incorruptible." These messages showed that Traoré's stance had won backing across political and ideological divides. Israel's reaction, by contrast, was muted. Netanyahu's office issued only a short, vague denial of the leaked remarks, avoiding any direct reply to Traoré's ultimatum. Instead of easing tensions, this fueled them further. Analysts on Africa News said it confirmed what many Africans have long felt, that their concerns are too often brushed aside rather than addressed seriously. Within 24 hours, the story had grown beyond a headline. It became a rallying cry that united citizens, diplomats, and commentators. For the first time in years, African unity was not just an idea, it was visible, urgent, and real, and the momentum kept building. Across Africa, people embraced Traoré's ultimatum as both a symbol and a turning point. In Burkina Faso itself, despite over 2 million people displaced by jihadist violence and more than 60% of the country outside direct government control, Traoré was seen as a figure of resistance and hope for unity. Public support for military rule has also surged under his leadership. A recent Afrobarometer survey showed 66% of Burkinabe citizens now accept military rule, compared to only 24% in 2012. His bold challenge to Israel's prime minister captured the imagination of youth and rural communities who increasingly see him as a modern-day Thomas Sankara, a leader ready to restore dignity and independence for Burkina Faso and for Africa as a whole. On the international stage, President Traoré's name has become a symbol of open defiance against outside political pressure. Demonstrations in his support broke out not only in Ouagadougou, where thousands shouted, "Long live Captain Traoré," but also in cities with large African diaspora communities such as London and Kingston. Protesters waved Burkina Faso's flag and carried banners demanding an end to foreign interference in African affairs. Inside Africa, commentators pointed out that Traoré's domestic reforms have strengthened his bold foreign policy. These reforms include nationalizing gold mines, building Burkina Faso's first gold refinery, and distributing tractors to farmers as part of a push for self-reliance. Still, the road ahead is fraught with danger. In the past year alone, more than 7,200 people have died from conflict in Burkina Faso, a steep rise compared to the 2,894 deaths recorded before Traoré took power. International human rights groups have also warned that forced conscription, arbitrary arrests, and the suppression of dissent could undermine his popularity if security and economic stability are not achieved. In this tense environment, Traoré's 48 hours ultimatum to Prime Minister Netanyahu was more than just a bold statement. It was part of a broader effort to redefine African diplomacy on Africa's own terms. For millions, that ticking clock became a lasting symbol, a demand for respect, dignity, and sovereignty that could reshape the continent's future. The ultimatum quickly spilled beyond diplomatic channels. Within hours, the political and social mood in Burkina Faso and across Africa shifted dramatically. In Ouagadougou, public squares filled with citizens showing support, holding banners reading "Africa stands with Ibrahim Traoré" and "Respect Africa." Student unions from Senegal, Ghana, and Nigeria issued joint declarations urging the African Union to stand with Burkina Faso, and even proposed economic and diplomatic measures against any nation that disrespects African sovereignty. This wave of civic mobilization carried clear political weight. In countries where people are often disengaged from politics due to disappointment with their leaders, the incident reignited a shared sense of purpose. Commentators across African media noted that it crossed religious, ethnic, and regional divides, with leaders from Christian, Muslim, and secular states, all agreeing on one principle: African dignity is non-negotiable. In Burkina Faso, the impact was immediate. President Traoré, already popular for his nationalist message and reforms, saw his approval ratings rise sharply after the ultimatum. Opposition figures, once vocal critics of his military-led rule, now hesitated, fearing their criticism could be seen as unpatriotic in a moment of national unity. The African Union, often accused of reacting too slowly, began urgent talks. Insiders said several states were preparing a joint response if Netanyahu failed to apologize within the 48 hours deadline. Still, analysts cautioned that high public expectations could be risky. If the ultimatum produced no concrete results, disillusionment might follow. But for now, the momentum was undeniable, reshaping Africa's political landscape in ways difficult to reverse. Beyond unity, Traoré's ultimatum sparked deeper debates. In several parliaments, lawmakers pushed to review trade agreements with Israel, arguing that no partnership could continue without mutual respect. Governments in South Africa, Namibia, and Tanzania even suggested a continent-wide reassessment of diplomatic priorities if no apology came. The incident also pushed regional alliances to rethink their collective power. ECOWAS, once focused mainly on economics and conflict resolution, began debating whether to take a stronger foreign policy stance. The message was simple but powerful. African nations should stand united not only in trade, but also in questions of dignity and respect on the global stage. Inside Burkina Faso, the impact on society was profound. Communities long divided by conflict found new unity in the symbolism of the president's words. In insurgency-hit villages, local leaders said people now saw their struggles as part of Africa's larger fight for sovereignty. Even displaced families in makeshift camps repeated the ultimatum around cooking fires, turning it into a story of shared pride. But the momentum came with risks. International financial institutions quietly warned that Burkina Faso's confrontational foreign policy might scare away investors or invite sanctions from Western blocs. Envoys from Europe and North America sought private meetings with Traoré's advisors to find out whether the country intended to go beyond symbolism. Still, across Africa, the ultimatum was hailed as a rare show of unapologetic leadership. Media coverage highlighted not just Traoré's boldness, but also his strategic silence afterward, which left the burden of response squarely on Netanyahu. By the end of the 48 hours, one thing was clear. No matter the outcome, Africa's political landscape had changed. The ultimatum redrew the boundaries of what was acceptable in diplomacy with African nations, and gave the continent a striking example of what it means to speak with one voice. And the shockwaves went far beyond Africa. The ultimatum reached the halls of power in Washington, Paris, Moscow, and Beijing. For the United States, used to a quieter African diplomacy, Traoré's declaration was a reminder that the continent's leaders could now command the global stage on their own terms. American political analysts debated Traoré's ultimatum with unusual intensity, treating it not as a passing headline, but as a moment of genuine disruption in global affairs. In Washington, some voices dismissed it as reckless, arguing that such bold defiance might fracture fragile strategic alliances and complicate U.S. relations in the Sahel. Yet others, particularly a rising generation of African-American scholars, writers, and activists, saw it in starkly different terms. To them, this was not recklessness, but clarity, a pure assertion of sovereignty from a continent too often silenced. On campuses from Howard University to UCLA, student forums sprang up almost overnight. Classrooms turned into arenas of debate. Young Africans and African Americans spoke passionately about what it meant to hear, in real time, a sitting African president refusing to bow before the weight of global powers. They weren't just analyzing words, they were celebrating courage, the rare kind that defies convention in full view of the world. In New York City, the African diaspora poured into Harlem, converging in the very streets that had hosted civil rights marches decades earlier. Flags of the United States and Burkina Faso were lifted side by side, fluttering in the late summer air. Chants rang out, "Africa stands tall, Africa stands proud." To the marchers, this was not about isolationism or rejecting cooperation with the international community. It was about drawing a line saying that cooperation must be built on respect, equality, and mutual recognition. Many carried handmade signs quoting Traoré's ultimatum verbatim. Others simply raised portraits of Thomas Sankara, as if to remind the world that a new generation of uncompromising African leadership had risen from the same soil. Globally, the shockwaves rippled unevenly. Moscow and Beijing quickly amplified the moment, their state media hailing Traoré as a symbol of defiance against Western dominance. They painted his ultimatum as part of a broader shift, the global South, asserting itself against the hierarchies of the old world order. In Europe, the reaction was more careful, even nervous. Leaders in Brussels, Paris, and Berlin avoided direct condemnation, choosing instead to emphasize the need for constructive dialogue. Yet between the lines, analysts detected unease. The old balance of influence in Africa was clearly shifting. In the Middle East, responses were sharply divided. Some governments called the move an unnecessary provocation that risked escalating tensions, but others, in private conversations and commentary, quietly admired the boldness of a small African nation, forcing a powerful leader like Netanyahu onto the defensive. What united these perspectives was one acknowledgement: Ibrahim Traoré had changed the terms of engagement. He did not beg for recognition, nor did he position Africa as a supplicant. Instead, he declared with the authority of history and the urgency of now that Africa already has its place, its table, and its dignity. For millions watching across Africa and abroad, this was not merely about one man's words. It was about seeing, perhaps for the first time in a generation, an African head of state standing before the cameras of the world and refusing to bow. It was a vision of dignity that no adversary could erase and no ally could ignore. As the countdown ticked closer to its deadline, the drama deepened. With 48 hours left, diplomatic correspondents began to whisper of unusual movements. Rumors spread that Israel was quietly reaching out to multiple African capitals, sending private feelers through intermediaries in search of back-channel discussions. There was no press release, no admission of error, only vague phrases like clarifying misunderstandings. But the timing mattered. In Addis Ababa, seat of the African Union, senior officials read this as a clear sign. The ultimatum was working. For decades, African demands had been met with silence, diversion, or outright dismissal. Now, before the clock even ran out, backroom diplomacy had been forced into motion. That alone felt like a victory. Back in Burkina Faso, the atmosphere was electric. Word of the rumors spread by radio, through neighborhood gatherings, and in village assemblies. In markets, in mosques, in churches, people debated what it meant. The conclusion was unanimous. Traoré's stance had compelled one of the world's most entrenched powers to pause and rethink. For many, this was not just about Netanyahu. It was about Africa finding its collective voice in the international arena. The symbolism was immense. Africa was no longer defending its image passively. It was actively shaping the conversation of global diplomacy. For the first time in decades, the balance of power, however, slightly tilted toward Africa. And it had not been achieved through armies or economic blackmail, but through something simpler, something purer, an unapologetic assertion of dignity. This was the kind of moment that could inspire not only a single nation, but an entire continent, teaching future generations that the right to stand tall is claimed, never gifted. When the final day of the ultimatum arrived, the expected apology from Prime Minister Netanyahu did not come. But in truth, what followed was even more telling. Across Africa, leaders who had once distanced themselves from Traoré's firebrand rhetoric began to cite him with respect. In Senegal, in Ghana, in South Africa, officials acknowledged publicly or privately that his stance had set a new standard for African diplomacy. Even in capitals with close ties to Israel, the conversation had changed. Traoré had redrawn the boundaries of what was acceptable in relations with Africa. The true twist, then, was not whether an apology was delivered. It was the revelation of what the 48-hour challenge had accomplished. One unwavering voice, standing alone at a podium in Addis Ababa, had shifted the perception of an entire continent. By refusing to bend, Traoré had not only defended Burkina Faso, he had elevated himself into the lineage of leaders who define historical eras. And for millions watching, the message could not have been clearer. Africa does not beg for a seat at the global table. Africa builds its own table. Those who wish to join must come with respect. In the end, the ultimatum transcended politics. It became a mirror in which Africa saw its own strength reflected from the hands of farmers in rural Burkina Faso to the voices of students in Nairobi, from traders in Accra to community leaders in Johannesburg. Everywhere, people spoke with renewed pride. They understood that sovereignty is not granted from above. It is claimed, lived, and defended. This was never about aggression. It was about dignity. It was about a principle older than empires, that no nation, however powerful, has the right to belittle another. Traoré's words resonated because they carried the weight of centuries, the unbroken line of Africans who fought for freedom, justice, and equality, from the anti-colonial struggles of the past to the challenges of today. As Traoré himself declared, "We do not ask for permission to be free. We rise to claim it." If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré has touched your heart, share this story. Let the world know that Africa's voice will be heard not as an echo, but as a force. May God bless Africa.